Most of you watching this video are probably pretty familiar with the entirely manufactured Ilhan Omar controversy that's been going on for a while now. I haven't talked about this on the show yet because I find this so ridiculous. I kept expecting it to die out already, but it hasn't. I want to give a real quick summary of the situation so my position on this whole thing up to this point is very clear. Then I'll get to some of the more recent developments, including the House resolution that was originally intended to condemn Ilhan Omar's statements about AIPAC. All of this nonsense started up back when Ilhan Omar sent out an extremely short tweet where she quoted a tweet from Glenn Greenwald, who was talking about Kevin McCarthy, who's in Republican leadership, was threatening to punish Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib for their criticisms of Israel. She said in her tweet that, quote, "It's all about the Benjamins, baby." She was clearly making light of the fact that AIPAC and the pro-Israel lobby in general has spent a lot of money influencing U.S. politicians, which is why a lot of them go so over the top in their defense of any criticisms of Israel. This is one of the most benign, uncontroversial statements one can make on the topic. Clearly, the pro-Israel lobby, groups that are legally registered to lobby on behalf of the Israeli government. Of course, they're trying to get influence for more favorable treatment of Israeli interests. But the smear merchants on both sides of the establishment took her tweet and interpreted it in an extremely disingenuous way. Some of them were trying to impose on this tweet was that, intentional or not, Ilhan Omar was referring to anti-Semitic tropes that Jews control the world with their money. I see no honest interpretation of Ilhan Omar's original statement where you can say, no, when she's talking about money, she isn't talking about the extremely powerful, influential pro-Israel lobby. Instead, what she actually means is that these sneaky Jews are in the background secretly being the puppet master controlling everyone with their money. There were even some hacks who were actually trying to downplay the influence that AIPAC has on U.S. politicians, which is insane. David Pakman, in his unbelievably hacky video where he smeared Ilhan Omar for her tweets, was insinuating that even if politicians take money from AIPAC, that doesn't necessarily mean they are being legally bribed into taking positions that are favorable to the far-right Likud party in Israel. This is an incredibly intellectually inconsistent argument from Pakman. Because any other industry or lobby, he will be the first to admit that special interests donating to political campaigns is a form of legalized bribery where they are trying to buy influence. But he's carving out some kind of weird exception for AIPAC and other pro-Israel lobbying groups and saying when they give money to politicians, it's just because they already agree with them on their position. It doesn't necessarily mean that they are trying to bias policy in a pro-Israel direction, which is the exact opposite position he would take if we were talking about the pharmaceutical industry lobbying politicians for favorable policies, or the military-industrial complex lobbying politicians for favorable policies like no-bid contracts and things like that, or the retail and fast food industry lobbying politicians like keeping workers' wages low. In any of these circumstances, you would admit that the money that these lobbies are spending is effectively systemic legalized bribes. But for his own arbitrary reasons, he came to the conclusion that it's not the case for AIPAC, and also that it's anti-Semitic to say that that's the case for AIPAC. So the line of argument that I was hearing from people who are trying to make it seem like AIPAC doesn't actually buy politicians is one of the dumbest and obvious bullshit lines of argument during this whole non-scandal. What really stood out to me was the more rabid, militant Israeli defense squad that exists to defend the Israeli government from criticisms of their actions to uphold an apartheid state and perpetuate systemic human rights abuses. The Israel Defense Squad, which comprises of many people in the mainstream media and a lot of establishment pro-Israel Republicans and Democratic politicians. These are the people who go out of their way to provide the most over-the-top, irrational defense of Israel, even at the slightest, most valid criticisms. And the people I'm talking about, Kevin McCarthy, Steve Scalise, Chuck Schumer, Barry Weiss, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, Marco Rubio, Ann Coulter, Lindsey Graham. They clutch their pearls in the most dishonest way imaginable and pretend that the tweet from Ilhan Omar itself was anti-Semitic, which is laughable. Then they try to use a tweet that they are clearly twisting and taking out of context as evidence that she is some type of raging anti-Semite who hates all Jews. Therefore, any criticisms of Israel that come out of her are by default coming from a place of anti-Semitism. As if smearing her like that wasn't bad enough, these hatchet men then go after Ilhan Omar's career by trying to get her removed from the Foreign Affairs Committee because she believes that the committee is overly biased in favor of Israel, and there is pressure within the committee to never criticize or say anything bad about the Israeli government. Again, an extremely valid critique, and later in the video I'll explain exactly what the Foreign Affairs Committee's clear pro-Israel bias looks like. When it became clear that they were overreaching trying to get her kicked off the Foreign Affairs Committee, they tried to get Nancy Pelosi and Democratic leadership in the House to vote on a formal resolution to condemn Omar for anti-Semitic remarks, again, that she did not make. That was also met by a lot of resistance by progressives because that is clearly bullshit. You want to condemn Ilhan Omar for making anti-Semitic remarks when up until this point, all she's done is criticize the influence that the pro-Israel lobby has bought in the U.S. and the clear bias that the Foreign Affairs Committee has when it comes to all issues related to Israel. So I guess to take some of the heat off of her, Ilhan Omar decided to issue a non-apology apology where she basically said, "I'm sorry if your feelings are hurt." I personally would not have apologized because she did not say anything wrong, but again, that's just my opinion. Then days into this manufactured controversy, Ilhan Omar was the victim of actual bigotry and xenophobia and racism when someone hung up a meme of Ilhan Omar trying to smear her that she had some type of direct connection to the 9/11 terrorist attacks just because she's a Muslim. At first, the Democratic leadership in the House was getting a lot of pushback from progressives defending Ilhan Omar from these baseless, tacky smears of anti-Semitism. Now progressives are also having to defend Ilhan Omar in the midst of all of this because she became the real victim of hatred and racism and bigotry. So the Democratic leadership in the House decided to pump the brakes a little bit on the smear Ilhan Omar train because the optics of this was just proving her original point and making it look like they were throwing one of their own under the bus. Now, instead of a resolution condemning anti-Semitism, which was intended to be a slap in the face to Omar, the House passed a resolution condemning bigotry in all forms, including against Muslims. Really, the resolution doesn't do anything. Ilhan Omar still has her spot on the Foreign Affairs Committee. But this entire manufactured scandal was just another great example of how the establishment smear machine works when you directly take on one of their sacred cows. Particularly in this case, the sacred cow is the U.S. unwavering support of the far-right Netanyahu government and the influence that the pro-Israel lobbying and groups like AIPAC have in forcing politicians to make ridiculous, over-the-top defenses of Israel. What has been one of the most annoying parts of this whole thing is, yet again, instead of talking about the real issue, which is that the way that the Israeli government treats Palestinians is wrong, and the pro-Israel lobby in the U.S. is paying for our complicity in war crimes and human rights abuses. We're having a false debate about whether or not someone's criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic. Look at any aspect of the U.S.-Israeli government relationship, and it is easy to see how any objective analysis will lead you to that conclusion. We continue to sell Israel billions of dollars worth of weapons every single year that they are using to carry out apartheid and a genocide in Gaza and the West Bank. Back in 2014, Netanyahu bombarded Gaza and the West Bank with airstrikes, killing thousands of people. A UN report found that 84% of the people who were killed were innocent civilians. And they were killed with weapons that the U.S. sold to the Israeli government. The whole time this was going on, instead of stepping in and stopping it, the Obama administration and Congress continued to approve weapons sales to Israel mid-genocide. And yes, it was a genocide because this was not a two-sided fight. This was extremely one-sided. Almost all of the casualties and injuries were on the Palestinian side, while there were next to no Israeli deaths or injuries relating to the conflict in 2014. In the middle of all of this, Netanyahu bombed the last power plant in Gaza, which still has not been repaired to this day. So Gaza and the West Bank are basically an open-air prison. The living conditions are untenable. Palestinian territory is blocked off on all sides by Israel and Egypt and the rest of their neighbors. They cannot bring in necessary foreign aid that includes food and medicine to help millions of Palestinians who desperately need it. Because Netanyahu bombed the last working power plant, many people in that area only get electricity for about 4 hours a day. It is basically impossible for any modern society to live 20 hours a day without electricity. And mind you, The West Bank and Gaza are in the middle of a desert in the Middle East. It gets insanely hot during the day and especially during summer, and they have no air conditioning. They can't even stop the little food that they do have from going bad because they can't keep it cool because they don't have power to keep the refrigerators and the freezers running all day long since they only have power for about 4 hours. The same for medicine that needs to be stored at certain temperatures. Then Palestinians decided to do the Great March of Return in order to protest for some of their basic human rights that were being violated every single day by the Israeli government. A UN report that was just released found that the Israeli government committed war crimes when they were retaliating against peaceful protesters along the border of Israel and the West Bank back in 2018. They killed hundreds of unarmed innocent civilians and injured thousands more since last March. The Israeli military, on purpose, with sniper rifles, shot unarmed women, children, journalists who were wearing press jackets, and medics who were treating the injured. All of these things I've listed are war crimes. What has been the response from U.S. politicians to the actions of the Israeli government? It has been unwavering, irrational, completely one-sided support of Netanyahu. Even though they're clearly committing war crimes, violating human rights, and doing all of that with weapons that they're getting from the United States. By any objective analysis of the situation, the U.S. is directly facilitating war crimes and human rights abuses with the support we give to the Israeli government. The only rational response from U.S. politicians who claim to care about human rights and freedom and democracy and all that bullshit would be to immediately cut off Israel and stop sending weapons and foreign aid to a country that is carrying out a genocide right now as we speak. But for decades, we see the exact opposite from establishment politicians in both the Republican and Democratic Party when they are confronted with these criticisms of the Israeli government, specifically Netanyahu. Instead, you have the Israel Defense Squad with people like Chuck Schumer and Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise and Tom Cotton, all these establishment politicians who take money from AIPAC. They come out and do these ridiculous mental gymnastics and bending over backwards to defend Israel's actions, and then to flip the conversation away from the wrongdoings and human rights abuses of the Israeli government and turn it into a witch hunt where they claim anyone who criticizes Israel is by definition anti-Semitic and should be shamed and smeared publicly for it. They do it when Israel is under scrutiny at the UN for human rights abuses and war crimes. You can have almost every country in the entire planet come out and agree what Israel is doing is wrong when they are building these settlements and stealing homes from Palestinians and stealing Palestinian land. They are violating Palestinians' rights, and we need to do something about that immediately. But the U.S., regardless of whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in office, they come out and make the ridiculous argument that every other country is being anti-Semitic against Israel, and their criticisms are illogical and based entirely on anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews. They do that whenever any prominent figure in the U.S. steps up and speaks out against the actions of the Israeli government. The establishment hatchetmen in the Israel Defense Squad will come out in full force and they will try to smear you, they will destroy your career, they will call you an anti-Semite, and they'll say you're just as bad as Nazis. Especially if you're a prominent black political figure. Look what CNN did to Mark Lamont Hill when he gave a speech at the UN calling for an end to the human rights abuse by the Israeli government. CNN fired that man. He is no longer a political commentator at their network because he dared to speak out against the war crimes of the Israeli government. Look at the hell that is raining down on Ilhan Omar for merely bringing up the fact that the pro-Israel lobby in the United States has an insane amount of influence over politicians in the direction of our policy. These rabid, irrational defenders of Israel tried to have her thrown off the Foreign Affairs Committee, and they tried to have her formally censured with an official vote in the House. All because she dared to speak out against AIPAC. So I definitely side with Ilhan Omar in this entire ridiculous, non-scandal controversy that's been going on for weeks. What she's doing is extremely important because typically most politicians shy away from speaking about AIPAC and Israel-Palestine in general because they know the backlash that they will receive. But Ilhan Omar told the establishment She told all her full outraged critics to go kick rocks because it's about time somebody spoke the truth about what's going on between the U.S. relationship with Israel, where we continue to facilitate their genocide and war crimes. Much props to Ilhan Omar for once again speaking the truth about U.S. foreign policy and the corrupt influences that lead us to making the irrational decisions that we make. She's one of the only members of Congress to have the balls to take on AIPAC and the pro-Israel